Savournin, singer, director, and founding artistic director of Charles Court Opera.
Hi, nice to be here.
Andrew Crowther, playwright and author of Gilbert and Sullivan.
Great to be here, thank you.
Ian Bradley, historian and author of Arthur Sullivan, A Life of Divine Emollient, and Oh Joy, Oh Rapture, the enduring phenomenon of Gilbert and Sullivan.
Hello, nice to be with you.
And John Crace, GNS fan, parliamentary sketchwriter for The Guardian, and author of, most recently, A Farewell to Calm and Decline and Fail. Good puns. Thank you for your hard work, John, making us smile when one's natural instinct is to hide under a duvet. We'll be talking about divided personalities, Victorian morals, censorship, topical satire, patriotism, and British musical taste. But first, let's hear a clip from last year's production of The Pirates of Penzance.
How beautifully blue the sky, the glass is rising very high. Continue fine, I hope it may, and yet it rained but yesterday. Tomorrow it may pour again, I hear the country wants some rain. Yet people say, I know not why, that we shall have a wonderland. Tomorrow it may pour again, I hear the country wants some rain. But people say, I know not why, that we shall have a wonderland. Tomorrow it may pour again, I hear the country wants some rain. How beautifully blue the sky, the glass is rising very high. Continue fine, I hope it may, and yet it rained but yesterday. Tomorrow it may pour again, I hear the country wants some rain. People say, I know not why, that we shall have a wonderland. People say, I know not why, that we shall have a wonderland. Yes,
So, John, can you briefly sketch the plot for HMS Pinafore, just so that we know what we're talking about?
It's a very, to coin a phrase, topsy-turvy tale, which wraps up in a reasonably ludicrous fashion. But fundamentally, it's poking fun at the British class system via a story of love, where a sailor, Rafe Rackstraw, believes that he has an unrequited love for Josephine, who is the captain's daughter. And the story follows how they find each other but struggle with the difficulty of the difference in their rank, which it also has consequences for other characters. The captain, who has interest in the bumboat woman, Little Buttercup, and so on, and Sir Joseph Porter himself is interested in marrying Josephine. And I won't spoil it for anybody who doesn't know the ending of the story, but it resolves through a secret that Little Buttercup reveals, and of course it is set on board a fictional vessel which is entitled HMS Pinafore,
Which is docked in Portsmouth, yes?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. How did you refer to Buttercup? A what woman?
Oh, a bumboat woman.
Okay, could you please translate?
Literally, she travels in a bumboat to go to the ship where she sells her wares to the sailors. Somebody else can chime in with a more accurate description of bumboats if they like, but that's how that's what I've always taken it to mean, right?
Okay, I would like more on this. I'm sorry, and Andrew, what is your interpretation of a bumboat?
I'm not sure I've got much to add to what John's said, actually. Just a vendor of goods to sailors in harbour. Yeah.
Okay, we've got to where I was thinking we were going to get in about 20 minutes' time, much quicker than I thought we would. Ian, would a Victorian audience snigger at the word bumboat, or is that purely because we're here in 2022 and I have the brain of a 13-year-old?
No, I think they might raise a little titter. And I mean, it's interesting because one of the selling points of Gilbert and Sullivan was that they didn't cause any offence. It was very clean compared, for example, with Offenbach and French opera bouffe, which was seen as distinctly naughty. So I think there would have been a little titter about Bumboat. I haven't got my annotator Gilbert and Sullivan with me, so I can't quite remember how I did define it, but I would agree with John and Andrew that I think it was the word used for the women who came on at Portsmouth to sell goods. But I think there would have been a slight titter, yes.
Oh, sorry, John, go on.
I always think of bum bag in the same way, that you carry your bum bag with bits and bobs in it, and instead just change the bag out for a boat, and you've got the equivalent.
Well, thank goodness we're not in America. There's a formula going on here, isn't there? There's the romance, the class distinctions. What are the essential ingredients, do you think? Richard Trauber in Operetta, a theatrical history, identifies them as absurdity and sincerity. Andrew, do you think that's a fair summation?
The essence of the way Gilbert saw the world was that he thought it was fundamentally absurd. He thought that the way we behave doesn't really make much intellectual sense, and he was especially keen to poke fun at the conventions of stage drama, which package up apparently normal events, but packaged up in a very tight moral framework. The old sort of the good ended happily and the bad ended unhappily, that kind of neat happy ending thing, which Gilbert especially thought was absolutely ridiculous because it doesn't actually happen. So in the operas, he's having a lot of fun with playing with these conventions which have absolutely nothing to do with real life. I was going to say he's trying to show the reality underneath, but I'm not sure that's even the case. He's just having fun with the conventions and suggesting that, this is nonsense. We all know it's nonsense. But we can sort of enjoy it on that level.
Wonder how far we've come since then, though. I mean, just for a bit of context, we're in 1878, I believe. So Queen Victoria has been about 18 months. She's been now Empress of India. We've got Benjamin Disraeli as PM, if only. The first test match and the first Wimbledon tournaments have taken place. And there are anti-Russian demonstrations in Hyde Park. John, Crace, this is all starting to sound a little bit familiar, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. I mean, sort of, I don't know quite how it works for other countries, but Britain seems to have a long history of satire, really. I mean, we go back to sort of Swift and Pope, and sort of Gilbert and Sullivan fit very firmly in there. I mean, some of it is incredibly contemporary, as you say. Anti-Russian demonstrations. I mean, we've now got almost weekly demonstrations in London protesting against the war in Ukraine.
Ian, do you think that patriotism is something that is celebrated in HMS Pinafore or slightly lampooned?
Well, that's a very good question, Anna, and it relates back to what Andrew said. It's very hard to know when Gilbert has his tongue in his cheek and when he's being serious. There's a wonderful song, He is an Englishman, which actually says he might have been a Russian, a French or Turco-Prussian, so the Russians are referenced. And on the face of it, it appears to be sheer patriotism. It has a very central role in the operetta. But you could say that Gilbert is actually lampooning extreme patriotism, as he does in some of his other works. Sullivan, who is in a sense a much more straightforward character than Gilbert and tends to sort of see things as they are. Sullivan gives He is an Englishman a good kind of patriotic tune. Sullivan may have been in on the joke in a sense, but as Sullivan writes it, it becomes a good kind of rumpty-tumpty patriotic chorus. So it's very hard to say, and that's one of the joys about Gilbert and Sullivan, is you never quite know how seriously they're taking it themselves, and therefore you can read it in a number of directions. I mean, I agree with Andrew that Gilbert, in a sense, is the father of the theatre of the absurd. Sullivan is in a very different category, and as I say, is much more transparent, much simpler in a sense, much more sentimental. But I think with the patriotism, it's there if you want to read it. And of course, Gilbert himself was in many ways ultra patriotic, and he was terribly keen to get everything right. You know, he went down to Portsmouth. Pinafore is based on the Victory. He was absolutely fastidious about the naval uniforms. Every single button and medal had to be in exactly the right place. So part of him is wanting to play it absolutely straight and you know, laud the Royal Navy. And he himself was a volunteer in the militia and had a lot of patriotic qualities. But it's got this delightful kind of double edge to it, which is what makes it such fun.
Is there not some kind of sort of fioritura flourish on Italian, or have I imagined that?
Oh, you can put all sorts of flourishes in. I mean, I've seen Scottish productions where we've had a little touch of Hail Caledonia or some Scottish there is a little flourish. I mean, I don't know what you're going to have in the Holland production. You can put in all sorts of little bits under them, but I suspect there will be. There might be a little Russian flourish. Who knows?
There's two things that have sprung to my mind in this context. As an opera person rather than a comic opera person. First is when you were talking about Gilbert's character just there, it made me think of Don Alfonso in Così fan tutte. This manipulation of light and shade and upsetting conventions of the happy endings and all that kind of stuff. The other thing that obviously just popped straight into my mind was Billy Budd, when you've got them singing "Don't Like the French" with their hippity hoppity ways. I mean, I don't think we're particularly supposed to sympathise with those two officers at all, but it has a certain kind of ring which is so recognisably English, not just because of the language, I think. Can we just return to this idea of class? Sullivan's background was presumably quite different from Gilbert's. I mean, born in, was it Lambeth, son of a bandmaster?
Yes, that's right. From a rather more lower middle class background than Gilbert. The other thing about Sullivan is he didn't have a drop of English blood in him. We think of him as the great patriotic English composer, and in a sense he was, and a huge influence on Elgar, but he was almost entirely Irish in his background. Yes, his father was a military bandmaster at Sandhurst, and he grew up, although he was born in Lambeth, grew up in Sandhurst with the music of the parade ground, one of the key influences on him. He could play every single woodwind instrument by the age of 8. And the other great influence on him was Sandhurst Parish Church. He absolutely loved church music, which was his first and abiding love. But yes, he was from a lower middle class background, and in some sense could be seen to be a kind of social climber. He was very keen to, he revelled in his connections with the monarchy. He was a very close friend of the Duke of Edinburgh, who was the son of Queen Victoria. He loved high society. He very much, was a kind of classic Victorian example of upward social mobility. So yes, coming from fairly humble origins himself.
And how fundamental to his musical taste was his experience as a chorister at the Chapel Royal?
Absolutely fundamental. I mean, I've already said the parade ground at Sandhurst was key, and you get those wonderful marching songs in all his operas, not least Pinafore. The Chapel Royal was hugely influential, not just in confirming his love of church music, and the earliest things he wrote there were settings of the Psalms, were liturgical settings. He himself wanted to be remembered for his religious music, not for his work with Gilbert or his other collaborators at all. He said it was his sacred music that was his most the thing he was most proud of and he wanted to be remembered for. As a Chapel Royal chorister, he, of course, also was singing often for the royal family, so it reinforced this fascination and love he had for royalty. And he went on from the Chapel Royal to Leipzig as the very first Mendelssohn scholar. That was another huge influence. I mean, I think Mendelssohn is the composer who Sullivan is most like. There's a lot of Schubert in him as well, and but the Chapel Royal was absolutely fundamental to him. And of course, a lot of his writing in the operas with Gilbert has shades of church music. There are the madrigals. He loved Tudor church music. There are the great 4-part choruses, which could really be church anthems. A lot of the early amateur Gilbert and Sullivan societies came out of churches, particularly nonconformist churches, Methodist chapels, and you know, Sullivan wrote almost as though he was writing for church choirs. So it was hugely important as a formative experience.
So, John Savournin, is this how we end up with movements like Hail Poetry from pirates?
Yes, I think so. And also, you know, touching on something that both Ian and Andrew were talking about earlier, because of that Gilbert is there offering his absurdist view of us as a society through whatever means. Sullivan, in a sort of counterpoint to that, is then writing music around the material, which gives it this other quality. So in Iolanthe, it's a great example with the House of Peers, their text primarily being bow, bow, ye lower middle classes, bow, ye traitors, bow, ye masses. Is that right? And Sullivan sets it to this majestic tune. So this majestic melody and harmony that gives it this kind of almost ethereal quality. So you're left with this feeling, I think, where the characters take themselves very seriously. Now, that's not to say that they don't have fun. And I think it goes back to that first point that you made. You know, it's the sincerity that the characters have. And with that, then you get some actual situational comedy that actually works, because the characters really believe that they're in the situations. Well, you know, it's really interesting that you describe Gilbert as Alfonso. It's almost like he's got a banner above the stage as a Roman commentary saying, by the way, this is what I'm saying about all of this, but the characters have no idea. And I think that's you know, it's quite unique to the material, I think, in lots of ways.
Andrew, this divided personality that you've written so beautifully about, you know, sort of half impish, half authoritarian. What was his background? What made him who he was?
Ian's described Sullivan as coming from a more lower middle class background. I've been trying to think how I would describe Gilbert's background. I guess it's more middle class or lower upper middle, in a sense. He came from a background where his grandfather had earned a lot of money from the grocery trade, and that led to his father, who was called William Gilbert. He seems to have had an independent income, i.e., he didn't have to work for a living. So he's kind of has that gentlemanly lifestyle.
It's new money, isn't it? I mean, he wouldn't count it as,
but there's very little information about Gilbert's family background. But when I was writing my biography of Gilbert, I got the very strong impression that while Gilbert's parents were sort of maintaining this gentlemanly, leisurely lifestyle, may not have completely had the finances to live up to it. So while Gilbert's quite young, they sort of move over to Boulogne from London. They moved from London to Boulogne, and Boulogne at that time was a haunt for people who were sort of hiding a little bit from their creditors. And later on, when Gilbert is a young man, he works for a living as a very lowly civil servant at the Education Office, a job which he absolutely hates. So obviously, you know, he's having to work for his living, which is not the impression that he wanted to give of his background in later life. I should also mention that this is another contrast with Sullivan. Sullivan, I think it's very clear, came from a very loving family background, whereas Gilbert, his parents, well, they split up in a very acrimonious manner when Gilbert was in his 40s. This is the 1870s, and it's very clear that his parents, well, that their relationship has sort of broken down completely. And I think if you bear in mind that Gilbert did not come from a loving family background, I think that explains a lot of his attitudes to things like love and marriage and so on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What do you think, John Crace? Do you think that the stereotype of the sort of tears of a clown, broken-hearted comedian thing, does that seem to hold true throughout cultural history to you? There have been plenty of examples. I mean, think about Les Dawson, complex, tormented soul. I know we're not talking quite the same genre.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, they kind of I think it's very much depends on the particular era you're in. I mean, I was thinking about sort of satire today feels much more angry. You kind of feel with Gilbert and Sullivan that there is no offence given and none taken, really. There's a kind of complicit humour, really. Whereas, I mean, nowadays, sort of satirising what's going on in sort of Westminster, a lot of the satirists, myself included, are quite angry about the situation. I mean, only today we kind of find out that, the Chancellor of the Exchequer was on an American green card up until last year. And you kind of think he was an MP. And that means he thought he was a part-time Chancellor, whose primary residence was in the US. And you kind of think, well, this is sort of so beyond everything you could sort of dream of as a satirist. I mean, on one level, it's really funny and really absurd, but on another level, it's a total outrage.
It's a very interesting situation today, though, isn't it? Because, all the things that seemed absurd when we were watching them in, the thick of it or something like that, we have gone so far beyond that in real life.
Oh, yeah, the thick of it's become the norm, really.
Yes.
It's what we expect of politics.
Let's just go back to politics in 1878. Gilbert, I think, possibly Sullivan too, strenuously denied that Sir Joseph Porter was based on the bookseller W.H. Smith, who said he was the only man in England to know nothing about ships. Yeah. The Lord High Admiralty, help me out, John Savournin.
Yeah, he's the First Lord of the Admiralty.
First Lord of the Admiralty, yeah. Yes. Do you think it's true that they weren't basing it on W.H. Smith?
I mean, I'm afraid I'm not entirely clear on the details of the anecdote, and I suspect that Andrew or Ian will be much better placed to answer this than I. But I do recall, I believe, that the Queen wasn't very pleased with the similarity to W.H. Smith that she saw in the character. Is that right?
I think certainly Disraeli refused to believe that it wasn't supposed to be W.H. Smith. Yes. Sorry, Ian, do you want to take it from here?
Yes. I mean, W.H. Smith was the First Lord of the Admiralty in Disraeli's government, and everyone came to associate the character of Sir Joseph Porter with Smith. I mean, it's not the only example. Of course, we can find plenty of examples in the Gilbert and Sullivan operas of people, Bunthorne appeared to be based on Oscar Wilde. Sir Garnet Wolsey, who's referenced in The Skill of Sir Garnet attacking a cannibal in Patience, is possibly the model for the Major General in Pirates. I think they are careful not to particularly identify individuals. I mean, all sorts of people have had great fun in, Kenneth Baker, the Tory MP, was convinced that in Iolanthe, Gladstone was the model for the Lord Chancellor and Queen Victoria for the Fairy Queen. And, Gilbert obviously had people in mind. He did have a pretty strong satirical sense. I mean, John was saying it's much more bitter now. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think Gilbert could be pretty acid, and some of the songs that he wrote were actually cut out, particularly from Iolanthe, where there are some pretty devastating attacks on MPs and peers. So Joseph, yes, I think, it was designed so the audience might well think this was W.H. Smith. Other candidates have been proposed. I mean, some historians have suggested, I can't remember the various names, who were also First Lords of the Admiralty. I mean, the point, of course, is basically he's a politician, he's a career politician, he doesn't need to have anything to do with the Navy, and you could say the same now about the Defence Secretary, although our Defence Secretary happens to be a former soldier. But the point, that Gilbert's making is that basically these people end up running a department which they know nothing about. I mean, it's interesting actually to look at the politics of Gilbert and Sullivan. Gilbert's, and I'd be interested on Andrew's take on this, because Gilbert is much less clear to identify. Sullivan was a very strong Tory. Sullivan always voted Conservative. I've got a lot of evidence of that, and he's a strong, again, very interesting given his Irish background. In a sense, he's more English than the English. He's a monarchist, he's a Tory. Gilbert, much more difficult to classify. Gilbert in some ways appears to be a crusty old Tory, but actually when he's on the bench as a JP in Middlesex, he often favours the criminals, or the so-called criminals who are coming before him. He often actually defends them against the police. He has a very radical side to him. I don't think we ever quite know what Gilbert's politics are, whereas we do very clearly with Sullivan.
That's absolutely fascinating. The authoritarianism that extended to, he hated mugging, he hated ad-libbing. Is that correct? But we've come to expect it in well, certainly one of the Patter songs, the most famous one being I've Got a Little List from the Mikado. Sorry, John Crace, this is your moment. I want to know who would be on your little list today. You don't have to sing.
Who would be on my list to satirize? Sorry?
Yes, who would be on your little list?
Oh, well, you'd have to start with Boris Johnson, of course, and Partygate. I mean, that is sort of, it's taken a bit of a quiet turn because of the war in Ukraine, but it hasn't gone away. And we've got Rishi Sunak. Matt Hancock never lets you down. I kind of have a feeling that Gilbert and Sullivan would have an absolute field day with Matt Hancock, especially with the way that, Matt believes that he can be rehabilitated into government within a matter of weeks, really. And there is nothing he has a very low bar, a sense of shame, Matt Hancock. So he believes he can be rehabilitated very quickly. And then, of course, we have Liz Truss. And I have a feeling that would be Gilbert's sort of number one, with her sort of posing in front of flags, left, right, and centre. Any flag will do. And sort of almost she is Gloriana herself.
Yeah, I'm surprised you haven't mentioned our culture minister currently, although by the time
Nadine,
broadcast...
sorry, Nadine, our anti-culture minister. Yeah.
There goes our chances of getting Arts Council money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there was that amazing thing when in her first appearance between the Culture Select Committee, when she was pronouncing on the future of Channel 4, and she didn't even know how it was funded. You know, and she's proposing to sell it off. I mean, it's just remarkable.
Well, I think after that, we probably need to go to a little bit more music to recover. Here's another slice of the Pirates of Penzance.
With cat-like tread, upon our prey we steal, in silence dread, the water's way we feel. No sound at all, we never speak a word, a nice footfall would make we still be heard. So tell by we the pirate creeps, while all the house soundly sleeps. Bit, your life preserver, you may want to hit. Your silent matches, your dark lantern sees. Take your file and your skeletonic keys. Steal, in silence dread, a cautious way we feel. No sound at all, we never speak a word. A nice footfall would be seen and be heard. Come, friends who plough the sea, trust in navigation, take another station. Let's ready by the sea, wait a little burglary to cut the crab.
So that was another clip from The Pirates of Penzance, directed by John Savournin, who's with us this afternoon, this evening, whatever it is. I want to know from each of you, no, particularly from Andrew and Ian, this partnership, this extraordinary partnership between these two very, very different personalities, did they actually like each other?
That's a long answer, I think.
Okay, who wants to take it first? Andrew, you look like you're gearing up to say something.
Okay. Well, they obviously had very different personalities, and I think it depends which year. I think is a basic question here, because I think they got on really well early on in the partnership. So, you know, sort of from Thespis through to around about HMS Pinafore or Pirates. They're forever going around to each other's houses to sort of discuss things. I was thinking, for a very brief period, Gilbert has kept a diary during the writing of HMS Pinafore, and he talks about sort of go around to Sullivan's house because he's so excited about this new song he's written, and he talks about Sullivan coming to discuss the opera with him and stay talking till 3 a.m, you know, and things like that. But I think one turning point might have been with the international success of HMS Pinafore. Gilbert and Sullivan went over to the United States to bring the official production of HMS Pinafore to America. They were in enforced proximity for several months, and I think things began to get a bit abrasive at that point, and things began to escalate from there. And we then get into the sort of professional differences with Sullivan. With each successive opera, he starts to say more and more insistently, I want to do something more serious. I can't do another comic opera. I can't be doing with this topsy-turvydom anymore. And Gilbert's saying, well, I'm not the person to ask to do that. And he's also saying, we're phenomenally successful. Why not go on? And things like, and that kind of clash of opinion, which is very fundamental, of course, to their both of their professional lives, that embittered their relationship, I think, more and more as time went on. So it's a spectrum. It's over the years, really.
Ian, Sullivan was also incredibly busy with other roles at this point, wasn't he? I mean, directing, was it Leeds Festival? He was incredibly active conductor. Plus, of course, he was also composing other music. Do you think that that's what pulled it apart between the two of them?
It was one aspect. I would entirely agree with Andrew. I mean, I think initially it was quite harmonious. It got increasingly frustrating for Sullivan, partly because he constantly felt he was playing second fiddle. Don't forget that the way they worked was the words came first. The words had primacy, and in a sense, this established the modus vivendi for musical theatre throughout the 20th century. It was the same with Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Lowe, not significantly with Lloyd Webber, who always produced the music, and his librettists had to fit in with his music. But Gilbert, in a sense, was driving it. It was Gilbert's lyrics that Sullivan was having to set, and he felt he was a mere wordsmith. And as you say, his heart, in some senses, was in his oratorios, in the Golden Legend, which was more performed in the last 25 years of the 19th century than anything other than the Messiah. He was seen, Sullivan, he was going to be the great British Brahms. He was going to be the great composer that we'd never had. The Germans described us as das Land ohne Musik, the land without music. Sullivan was going to be the man who would change all this, and yet he was stuck here writing comic operas, and indeed, in a sense, he felt they were beneath him. He got increasingly frustrated with Gilbert, absolutely, as Andrew said, because of Gilbert's obsession with topsy-turvy plots, particularly the magic lozenge, which Gilbert kept coming back to, which had been the theme of their first major collaboration, The Sorcerer, just a year before Pinafore, all about a magic lozenge. People take it and they fall in love with the first person they see. Gilbert loved it. Sullivan just found it silly, and Gilbert kept coming back to the magic lozenge. What actually saved them was the Gondoliers, which was probably their happiest collaboration, and they were both very nice about each other. But what kept Sullivan going, frankly, it was the money. Sullivan had an extremely expensive lifestyle. He gambled. He was an addictive gambler. He lost thousands and thousands of pounds, both in cards, in roulette, in horse racing. He had a fairly racy private life, and he needed a lot of money. And he calculated that he was earning, in 1880, his annual salary just from the Gilbert and Sullivan operas was £10,000, which is the equivalent of about 1.3 million today. Far more, for example, than Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone was getting. His salary was only £7,500. So Sullivan is making big bucks by sticking with Gilbert. And of course, this is really what keeps the partnership going, I think. He's incredibly frustrated by Gilbert. He finds the silliness, the topsy-turviness. He keeps saying, will you write me something which has got real romance, real feeling, passion? And Gilbert says, this is not what I do. But the money is absolutely fantastic, and it fuels Sullivan's very expensive lifestyle. So I think that is actually what keeps the partnership going. But Sullivan's heart, as you say, is actually in his much more serious music, which of course is much less successful. It's not bringing in the same sort of money.
And that's partly because of publication, isn't it? Because we've got the rise of the amateur operatic societies, and therefore people will buy the vocal scores, and with each vocal score, there's going to be more money coming in. Did I imagine it, or did he live in an apartment that was decorated by Whistler?
Gosh, that's news to me. I mean, he kept moving to grander and grander apartments in Victoria Street, and I mean, he had a large number of servants. He had his mother with him for a long time. The other thing about Sullivan is he was an extraordinarily generous man. He would regularly give thousands of pounds to people who came up to him in the street saying they were hard up. It's possible that Whistler decorated his flat off Queen Victoria Street. I'm not sure. He might.
It could have been Singer Sargent. It's a sort of shred of memory I have that
I mean,
I
he lived in
picked up about somebody
style
else.
by the end. He had about 5 servants, and he was also always going off at weekends to country houses. You know, he wrote The Sorcerer, for example, in a country house near where I am now in Scotland. He wrote his most famous hymn tune, Onward Christian Soldiers, at a country house in Dorset, and dedicated. It's called St Gertrude because the lady of the house was Gertrude Clay Seymour, and he rather fancied her, I think, so he named the tune St Gertrude. So he was living a very high life, yes. And Whistler, of course, is also thought to be one of the models, possibly, for Bunthorne or Grosvenor in Patience.
Super. But Andrew, did Gilbert also have any pretensions towards doing something more sort of artistically serious at all?
Definitely, yes. He, very late in his life, when he was being interviewed for a short biography by someone called Edith Brown, he took great exception to her disparagement of what he thought were his best plays, which were blank verse comedies and a blank verse tragedy, a tragedy called Broken Hearts, and he did a version of the Faust legend called Gretchen, which I have to say are not especially good. But he took great exception to being criticised for these, and he said that I can't remember the exact phrase, but he talked about the easy trivialities of the Savoy libretti, and he didn't really, well, when he was in a certain mood, he didn't rate the Savoy operas very highly. But this is my opinion here, but to me, it's unarguable that the Gilbert and Sullivan operas are the best of Gilbert, and some people may disagree, but also the best of Sullivan, in that Gilbert was using everything, all the best parts of his ability in these operas. There's this kind of irrepressible irreverence. When he's on his best behavior in these blank verse dramas, he's so dull because he's suppressing his humor. He's suppressing his sense of the absurd in order, because he's being I'm being a poet now. Whereas in the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, he's not pretending. When he sees something that's absolutely ridiculous, he makes a joke about it. And I think, again, this is my opinion, but I think Sullivan sneakily quite enjoyed writing for Gilbert in the sense that he did share a sense of humor with Gilbert, even though, sort of he wanted to write oratorios and grand opera and so on, but every time Gilbert makes a joke, has an amazing joke in a song, Sullivan makes the best of it. He sort of brings it out, and Gilbert said that the marvelous thing about Sullivan is that you never have to explain a joke to him. And he really got Gilbert's comic ethos, which was, yeah, when you're telling a joke, tell it with a straight face. Never let on to the audience that you're being funny.
John Crace, would you agree with that? That you can't show that you're being funny when you're being funny?
I always think, I mean, I agree with Andrew. I always think it's sort of, you know, the best humour is the humour that is sort of quite subtle. You know, it's the stiletto rather than the sort of sabre, look, I am being really funny now. And, you know, my favourite satirists aren't the ones that, you know, are really shouty on stage satirists. They're the ones that just sort of play it very straight, and then with one killer line, you kind of know where you are. And I mean, I would sort of slightly take issue with Andrew on the notion of because I think good humor can be quite serious at the same time.
Yeah.
And you know, and good satire should be funny. It should be available on a variety of levels. You know, you should get the joke, but also it should wound at some point. And so there is something quite serious about their comic operas as well.
Oh, definitely, yes.
John Savournin, do you stick to the idea that you have to deliver it with a straight face? You have to be unaware, your characters, as a director or, you know, and as the singer, that your characters have to be unaware of the absurdity of their situations, or indeed the absurdity of themselves sometimes?
Yes, I think it is quite important that is kept. But at the same time, there is a bit of a balance there, I think, where you can also spoil the humour by coming at it with sort of too cold an approach. And I think that it's about finding that balance, and it's the same with all comedy. You know, it's about finding that balance where you're aware that it's humour, but that as a performer, but that you're looking after the situation first and the character's sincerity in that situation first. I mean, I think that really is one of Gilbert's big strengths, is that he can write a scene which we as an audience can absolutely embrace the comedy of, and that the characters themselves do not play. And you know, it would be very interesting, I think. I'm not sure if John Crace would think of this, but it would be interesting, I think, if Gilbert was alive today. And what might he be actually writing? Would he be writing a foil for How I Met Your Mother, or For the Thick of It? Indeed, you know, would he be one of those writers? I suspect he probably would be, as he was. Though we have touched on the fact that he was always very careful to make sure that he was never absolutely saying that he was representing a particular person or situation, and I think doing that so that he could legitimately come on stage and go, well, if you thought it, then that's entirely up to you, but it wasn't, you know, I didn't put the thought in your mind. And I think he probably quite enjoyed that. But I think he would relish picking up on all sorts of things now, and, you know, goodness knows what he'd come up with right now.
It's quite nice to think of him in a writer's room, but then equally, I think he'd probably be an extremely good parliamentary sketch writer, wouldn't he?
Yes, and he made some wonderful sketches in his ballads that accompanied his various stories in publications and so on, you know, and many of those inspired the characters in the GNS operas as well.
Right, I want to ask each of you now what it was that first attracted you to Gilbert and Sullivan. John Crace, can I start with you? What appeal?
I think, I mean, Ian and Andrew have sort of touched on it already. I think it's the irreverence and the absurdity, really. We kind of just love being able to have a laugh at yourself, really, and at the world in general. I think it's as simple as that, really. You can take it on as many levels as you want to take it.
what you've just implied is that possibly we, as the audience, are actually not that far removed from the original audience, really. Maybe we haven't advanced that far.
Well, I think they still have relevance. I mean, it's not that the audiences haven't advanced that far. I think we clearly have in sensibilities, but I think there is a timeless element to the operettas themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I regret my use of the word advanced, because that sort of attached a judgment I didn't quite mean to use. I think more just that we've
I know
changed. I mean, obviously nobody's going to faint if somebody swears now, but yeah, I mean, it would imply that the anxieties about class, the anxieties about status, I mean, class being a particularly English thing, I think, class, status, and dare I say, a slight awkwardness around the opposite sex.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to see Gilbert and Sullivan do, doing something with Fawlty Towers. That scene, I mean, that is a sort of classic example of a writer torturing his characters and putting them into sort of extreme testing situation. And you kind of, every time, you come out of there sort of laughing and cringing at the same time.
Ian?
Yes, I would absolutely pick up what you just said about awkwardness about the opposite sex, because it's very significant, I think, that this panel is entirely male, apart from you, Anna. I have said in several of my books that Gilbert and Sullivan has a very male following. And of course, one of the things that Sullivan did not like about Gilbert was the way he caricatured women, and particularly older women. And we can see it even with Buttercup, the bumboat woman, a plump and pleasing person. She is rather poked fun at, and this gets worse and worse and worse. And I mean, Sullivan actually refused to set the original elderly, ugly daughter in Utopia Limited because she was such a grotesque caricature. And I think we need to explore this a bit, actually, because, Gilbert is often seen as profoundly misogynistic as well as misanthropic. He didn't have much time for his fellow human beings, but he seems to have had a particular thing about women. So I think there's a whole area to explore here. I mean, one of the most successful types of G&S production recently has been the all-male productions, the Sacha Reagan productions of Pinafore and Pirates and Iolanthe, which I think have been absolutely brilliant, but they're taking me back. I mean, you asked how we first came into Gilbert and Sullivan. I suspect many people came into it at an all-boys school, playing a sister or a cousin or an aunt at the age of 8, and then when your voice breaks, you play a sailor. And I think there's a very male side to Gilbert and Sullivan, which, I think Sullivan was somewhat uneasy about, and maybe we should be somewhat uneasy about it today. But, all my research suggests that it's a very, very, the fan base is very predominantly male.
I do have one girlfriend who's terribly into it, but she is an outlier. I must say, and I was going to get onto the whole women thing. And can I just say about all male panels, we had an all female panel for Carmen and an all female panel for Onegin. So this is payback. There is a quote from Gilbert from 1906. We resolved that our plots, however ridiculous, should be coherent, that our dialogue should be void of offence on artistic principles. No man should play a woman's part and no woman a man's. Finally, we agreed that no lady of the company should be required to wear a dress that she could not wear with absolute propriety at a private fancy ball. And I believe I may say that we proved our case. Now, I would agree with you, Ian, because mostly, I think, with the exception of Mad Margaret, who I think does have a bit more kind of sass and the chants are a bit more fun, the women are basically simpering virgins or battle axes. But I think that the problem actually extends to the male characters too, because people have romantic feelings about each other, but there's no sense of them having sexual feelings about each other. It's as though they've been kind of cut off at the neck. John Savournin, do you want to take this on a bit further?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I suppose some of that is about the time that they were written as well, about not kind of pushing too far into the kind of physical parts of the relationship and so on. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, though, I mean, I'm not saying that I don't absolutely fully agree with the fact that there are the portrayal of women in the pieces is flawed, and it's certain, by today's standards, it most certainly is. But it is also interesting sometimes to note that sometimes it is the female characters who have quite a bit of agency. So, for example, in Pirates, it is Mabel who chooses Frederick and takes that situation by the scruff of its neck, as it were, and makes a decision about what he needs to do, and it happens in others as well. In the Mikado, Yum Yum, she fundamentally decides not to marry Nanki Poo because it's turned out that he's going to be buried alive after he's been beheaded after they've got married. So there is. And even with the older characters, often I think that it's the wider view. I mean, talking about the male characters particularly, it's the other characters' view of those characters that feels problematic, and I think it's in a way it's character flaws really that are at the centre of that. The way that they look at a particular character, an older female character, is problematic, and of course whether or not Gilbert is making a point about that is another matter. But he also often allows a window into the soul of some of those characters. Caricature in the Mikado is quite a good point. She has a couple of very plaintive arias which discuss how she really feels, and ultimately she is given happiness. She finds happiness that she's looking for, and I wonder whether there is a thread somewhere. Well, Gilbert is saying this is the way that we frame this is incorrect, and whether that's a comment that he's trying to make rather than standing up and saying, I'm a horrendous misogynist, which may well be the case, but I think it's not completely black and white.
Okay, but we're not talking Rosencavalier, are we? I mean, the depiction of aging is not done with that kind of that kind of tenderness. And
no, it's absolutely not.
As regards Mabel, I mean, I just imagine they'll hold hands, maybe a peck on the cheek, and live happily ever after, and that's it. Sort of like Ken and Barbie with no genitals.
Yeah, and that may well be a symptom of the time in which they wrote, in which they were writing, or the audiences that they were trying to target, and so on. But yes, it's an odd thing.
Or is it Britishness?
Well, yes, maybe so.
No, I don't think so, because I don't think you find it in other works of the time. I think you're letting Gilbert off the hook a bit too much, John. I mean,
fair enough. As I say, it's
Sullivan. It was really something that annoyed Sullivan, was Gilbert's portrayal of particularly these older women. Sullivan found it very, very offensive, and I don't think you get it throughout Victorian comic opera. I mean, I don't think you do at all. I think there was something there with Gilbert that was, I mean, there's a sort of a very grim side to Gilbert, and I think Andrew's brought it out because of his childhood, and Andrew writes very movingly about that in your biography, that Gilbert was a very lonely only child, and Gilbert had a lot of what we nowadays call psychological hang-ups, and he had a profoundly pessimistic view of the world. And I think one of the things that Sullivan does is to lift a lot of Gilbert's very black lyrics because of the way he sets them. Is it but a world of sorrow, sadness set to song, or the world is but a broken toy? A lot of Gilbert's lyrics are profoundly dark, and a lot of what he says about women is profoundly dark, but we don't get that because Sullivan lifts them all, and because Sullivan's incapable of writing something that isn't sort of lyrical and beautiful and uplifting. So I think that actually, when we strip away the music, what we get from Gilbert is much darker and rather more sinister.
Yes, actually, I think you're quite right. And even thinking about Caricature's arias, the music really does lull you into a false sense obscurity there, doesn't it? But whereas actually the text itself is profoundly dark. In fact, so no, you're absolutely right.
Harrowing. I wonder, did we kind of lose something back in the 18th century, around about the time that John Gay was attacking Handel, and when Samuel Johnson called opera irrational and exotic, and the audiences instead needed to be, fed the oratories and the ballad operas. I wonder if, 200 years later, it seems from what I've read of Gilbert's recollections, what I've read about Sullivan's recollections, that, we were essentially stuck in the same place that we were in 1750, 1760. And then they come along and they create together something that is palatable to a native audience, which perhaps isn't naturally inclined towards opera.
One important point is that the whole culture in the 1870s and 1880s is so vastly different in that there's a very severe censorship of the stage. And, you were talking about the lack of sexual relationships in the operas. You couldn't have characters speaking in those terms in the 1870s and 80s because of the censorship, both official and unofficial, in that the Lord Chamberlain wouldn't allow it, and even if it did get through, audiences would probably have turned against it, because there was a very puritanical element, particularly amongst the kind of audience that Gilbert and Sullivan were wanting to cultivate. So you get that. But if we're talking about opera, La Traviata,
yes,
you again, we're in this whole world of extreme passion, which means forbidden relationships. Oh, you can't have a forbidden relationship on the Victorians. Oh, no. Mm-hmm. You might possibly get away with someone wanting to marry someone, but the parent, for the moment, disapproves. That you might get away with. But when you're getting to, oh, I've fallen in love with a prostitute. No, you're not going to get that on the stage. In 1870s London, unless it's a production of La Traviata, in which case there's a kind of little bit of a get out in that, oh, we'll accept that because these guys are Italian, so they're foreigners, they don't know any better, so we'll and it's so we hear it's a jolly good opera, so we'll bear with it. But
weirdly enough, the play was banned.
Yes,
but the opera went ahead.
Yes, I believe there was actually a big controversy when La Traviata was first produced in London. The people were saying, "Where's the Lord Chamberlain? How come you can perform the operatic version, but you can't perform the play? What's the difference?" And which was actually quite a good point, logically speaking. Yeah,
thundering editorials in the Times, I think, in 1856, concerned. I mean, it's a little bit like the Lady Chatterley's thing. Would you want your daughters or your servants to see this opera?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I think you're absolutely right. And I think class comes into this as well as morality, because opera is perceived as very elitist at this time, and we're partly back to the British thing. And as you say, in a way that it wasn't, I think, in the 18th century. So opera is immoral, and even Offenbach and the French opera bouffe is immoral. And what Gilbert and Sullivan do is create a completely new genre, which I would call musical theatre, which takes something from opera and something from the music hall. The music hall is, the popular kind of entertainment, which is also pretty risque, spitting on the sort of floor. And exactly. And what they do is to produce the perfect element for the new rising bourgeoisie in Victorian Britain who want something clean, and they don't want the prostitutes of La Traviata, they don't want the spitting on the sawdust floor of the music hall, and they produce this very durable, I mean, I see them as absolutely the precursors of the whole of musical theatre, which has, you know, arguably been the most powerful cultural icon of the 20th century in both Britain and America. And you know, they do it by concentrating on plot-led stories, on big role for a chorus, huge role for the set and the costumes. So everything that you get in a Rodgers and Hammerstein show or a Lloyd Webber show is there in Gilbert and Sullivan, and huge attention to production values and everything. And you know, they're taking something from opera, but not very much. And they're taking a bit from music hall and creating this new plot-led, character-led musical theatre.
That's very interesting. John Crace, do you think that the appeal is partly nostalgic, it's partly comforting to come back to Gilbert and Sullivan?
I can only speak for myself, really, and I think the answer is yes, really. You know, I mean, you can have, you know, new takes on Gilbert and Sullivan, but I kind of think that the basis there is that when you come into it, you come into a Gilbert and Sullivan opera with a sense of expectation of what you're going to get, and it is in a way sort of a kind of comfort food, really. And you know, no worse. I mean, and no worse for that. I mean, in the same way as that, you know, when you go and see a production of La Traviata, you know what you're going to get. You know, regardless of whether it's set in the middle of the sort of 19th century or has been updated.
John Savournin, how do you feel about that? Are you happy to provide comfort food? What kind of comfort food do you wish to provide? Are we talking, I don't know, a nice steak pie or a steamed pudding?
I don't know. I mean, it's a steak pie that you put a couple of chilies in, I think, isn't it? It's got. There is a nostalgia, there is a sort of comforting feel to the material, but there are things within it that are quite biting, I think, and I think that it's important not to forget that they're satire when creating a production of them. I think that that's important.
Thank you very much. So there we have it, steak pie with a few biting chilies added in. The Opera Holland Park season opens on May the 31st with Eugene Onegin, or Evgeny Onegin, if you are so inclined. HMS Pinafore runs from August the 9th to August the 13th, co-production with Charles Court Opera, directed by and starring John Savournin. Details can be found on our website, www.operahollandpark.com. My huge thanks to John, Ian and Andrew for their insights and their good humour, and to my colleagues Simon and Lima behind the screen. We look forward to seeing you at the park.
Although a dark career sometimes involves the crime of stealing, we rather think that we're not altogether void of feeling. Although we live by strife, we're always sorry to begin it. For what we ask is life without a touch of poetry in it.